Welcome to day 211 on the trail. We have four readings for today from Mark 12, verses 28 through 40, 1 Kings 2, verses 13 through 46, 1 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 1 through 29:30, and 4 Maccabees chapter 5, verses 1 through 38. In our reading from 1st and 2nd Chronicles today, we find the succession of the throne from David to Solomon. As a reminder, 1st and 2nd Chronicles contains a theological retelling of the story of David and Solomon. The central purpose of this retelling is to focus on the building of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, since it is widely agreed that 1st and 2nd Chronicles were written around the time of the return of the Jewish people from exile, the emphasis was therefore placed on the preparation and building of the first temple by David and Solomon, in order to support and encourage the construction of the second temple. This emphasis on their work and leadership in building the temple in Jerusalem may have also led the authors and compilers of 1st and 2nd Chronicles to leave out the darker chapters in the lives of David and Solomon. Therefore, we do not find the stories of David and Bathsheba, for example, or the uprising of Absalom, or the somewhat questionable actions of David and Solomon during their transition. Despite the faithfulness that we have seen throughout David's life, his actions at the very end of his life, while politically expedient, do not seem to be in keeping with his faithfulness and trust in God. First, David calls for the death of Joab, his longtime general. 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 6. Act therefore according to your wisdom, says David, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. Now, while Joab has fought at David's side and had led David's army, he had also acted in his own self-interests. Despite being told not to harm Absalom, Joab killed David's son. Also, Joab executes Abner, who had just established terms of peace with David. And he killed Amasa after he was placed in charge of the army by David. Therefore, perhaps David is concerned that Joab will act against Solomon and threaten the Davidic dynasty. Also, to support this position, 1 Kings mentions that Joab had supported Adoniah for succession to the throne and not Solomon. Second, regarding Shimei, who cursed David as he departed Jerusalem during the coup of Absalom, David had promised not to kill Shimei. However, David says this to Solomon. Verse 9. Therefore, do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man. You will know what you ought to do to him. You must bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol. Initially, Solomon brings Shimei to Jerusalem and places him under house arrest. However, when Shimei violates the terms of this agreement, Solomon uses this as a pretense for his execution. Also, Solomon sends the priest, Abiathar, into exile for supporting Adoniah. Abiathar had served David well and suffered alongside David over many years. Therefore, it seems that he deserved something better than exile. All of these moves appear to be motivated by the desire to secure and consolidate David's throne under the rule of Solomon. And they do not seem to paint the most flattering picture of this transition in power. Already, we can begin to see the struggle develop between faithfulness to God and having the king rely upon God for direction and security, or taking matters into their own hands. Rather than a blessing, this transition to Solomon seems to reveal the danger of the rise of autocratic power and spiritual decline. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus is continuing to answer questions from the religious leaders. Some questions, as we might expect, are meant to trap Jesus, or were, at a minimum, not an honest quest for truth, or even well-intentioned. However, there's another leader, a religious scholar, who appears to ask Jesus an honest question. He hears Jesus answer his opponents with integrity and wisdom, and decides to ask his own question. Mark 12, beginning in verse 28. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, he asked him, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Again, we have no indication that this is a trick question or something designed to trap Jesus. So Jesus answers him directly in two parts. Verse 29. Jesus answered, "The first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." As we discussed earlier on day 134 of the trail, the Shema is a central creedal statement of the Jewish people and is found in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. The Hebrew word which begins this passage, Shema, means more than to simply hear or listen. Instead, it is a call to a relationship of faithfulness, loyalty, and complete dedication to the one true God. In Judaism, the Shema is the definitive declaration of Jewish monotheism, or the existence of the one true God. Therefore, we find our identity in only one place. This is the only one source of truth and ultimate authority, only one to whom we owe our allegiance and dedication. And therefore, that truth and confession leads to this response. Verse 30. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. We are to love God, not fear, coercion, force of will, but a choice to love God with our whole being. As the prophet Hosea wrote, "For I desire steadfast love, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." The decision to love God with everything we are and do is the highest and first commandment. But Jesus does not stop there. This scribe did not ask for a second commandment, but Jesus offers it anyway. Verse 31. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. It is this second part that reveals our dedication to the first. We can say that we love God, but that statement is verifiable only by the second. Paul, in his letter to the church in Galatia, once wrote this, from Galatians 5, verse 14. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Why would Paul skip the first and move on directly to the second commandment given by Jesus? Because loving our neighbors is how we actively demonstrate our love for God. The letter of 1 John puts it this way, from 1 John chapter 4, verse 20. Those who say, "I love God," and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. Teresa of Avila, the 16th century Spanish nun, in her book Interior Castle, once wrote this: the surest sign that we are keeping these two commandments is, I think, that we should really be loving our neighbor. For we cannot be sure if we are loving God, although we may have good reasons for believing that we are. But we can know quite well if we are loving our neighbor. And be certain that the farther advanced you find you are in this, the greater the love you will have for God. For so dearly does His Majesty love us, that He will reward our love for our neighbor by increasing the love which we bear to himself, and that in 1,000 ways. This I cannot doubt. Finally, how do we love our neighbor? As ourselves. This is part of the commandment. We are called to love ourselves as well. For those who remember the cartoon figure Popeye, he had a famous saying, "I am who I am, and that's all that I am." Well, with all due respect, I think Popeye was wrong here. That is not all that we are. At least, that is not all that we are meant to be. Paul put it this way in 1 Corinthians, "But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me has not been in vain." We are not only a creation of the living God, but a child of God, and through the sacrifice of Jesus, a citizen of God's kingdom and part of God's family. We are renewed, redeemed, and restored. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.